All right, well, we are pleased to be joined today by Professor Elizabeth Hinton of Yale University, who is the author of the new book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. It's published by Liverlight. And if you enjoy this conversation today, I invite you all to the book launch. It will be a virtual book launch. We have the information there for you up on the screen, but it is happening this Tuesday, Election Day, at 6 p.m., sponsored by Haymarket Books. You can join for free. You can purchase a copy of the book if you want. You can even purchase a signed copy of the book, like I have right here. And since the book isn't out, I feel very lucky to have been able to obtain this advanced copy, which, as you can see, has been very well read. And Professor Hinton, it is such a pleasure to have you. Your book is so timely and so important because it puts in context many of the contemporary discussions we're having right here in Harrisburg and throughout the country about police reform, Black Lives Matter, systemic racism. But it does so in a historical way, rooting this in the history of rebellion beginning in the late 60s and sort of coming all the way up to the present day. Wanted to have you on, and I thought I could start with just a brief story, which is that when we first moved to Harrisburg, my wife and I, we were looking for a place to locate the bookstore. And we went through a number of different properties in the city. I remember going through the one that we eventually chose with the former owner, and it was dark, the windows were all boarded up, and it was a bright sunny day outside, and we were going through the building looking at it, and I said, why are all the windows boarded up? And they said, oh, we boarded those up during the riots. I'm like, what riots? And they said, oh, the riots back in '68, and and of course this is 30 years later, and they're still boarded up. That business had left town, the building was abandoned, and we were pleased to rehab it and bring it back. But in some ways, it's a story about how things didn't change in the aftermath of the riots, and how that sort of runs contrary to the more optimistic narrative that our story of the civil rights movement and how it's led to progress. Your book tells a much different story, and let's just begin by letting you introduce the main concepts at play here in America on Fire.
Well, first, Mayor, I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. It's truly an honor to be in conversation with you, and exciting to know too, or I guess interesting that that the bookstore is also kind of a piece of this longer history of violent protests in Harrisburg and rebellion. And the book is really trying to get us to one, grapple with some of the shortcomings of the civil rights movement that didn't necessarily go far enough to securing some of the larger socioeconomic aims that were at the kind of center of the nonviolent protests that steered the civil rights movement throughout most of the 60s. And by the end of the 60s, in the context of continued mass unemployment and dilapidated housing and failing or exclusionary public schools, in the case of Harrisburg, the kind of seeds of the rebellion of '69 began in the school system when Black students demanded a more robust Black studies curriculum and the hiring of Black teachers. The book is trying to grapple with the prevalence of this political violence. Harrisburg joined in the kind of period after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which signaled a real kind of turning point in terms of the politics of nonviolence within the mainstream movement, right? So Harrisburg was one of nearly 2,000 rebellions that occurred throughout the United States between 1968 and 1972. And so the book is asking serious questions that allows us to grapple and confront the political violence that rocks the nation during this period, and linking it to the similar socioeconomic demands of the civil rights movement. And part of this too, I'm pushing us to change the ways in which we view these acts of political violence. And one of the points that I really stress is that labeling these incidents as riots, which Lyndon Johnson did from like kind of the very first eruption in Harlem, 1964, doesn't take seriously the demands of the people who participated in these events, and instead labels them criminal and meaningless, so that the only response is not, the kind of root causes in employment issues and school systems and housing, and being kind of treated as first-class citizens in American society, but instead more police, which creates this kind of cycle of police violence and rebellion. And one of the things that we see playing out time and time again, and we see this very clearly in the eruptions in Harrisburg, is that police violence, the police response to this form of direct action protest, only ends up precipitating more community violence.
Yes, it is an important story. It's a timely story, and I have to say there's quite a lot about Harrisburg in the book, and it's not just Harrisburg. It's about sort of maybe previously overlooked stories of urban rebellion throughout the country, but in Harrisburg in particular, as you say, our story it began with a simple request among students to have more African American teachers, more Black studies in the curriculum, and it eventually led to the shooting of an unarmed young student in the back by a white Harrisburg police officer. Can you, whatever aspects of that you'd like to share with our viewers, can you talk a little bit about that? I think one of the interesting things about Harrisburg is it resulted in a lot of testimony before a Human Relations Commission, and that's a part of our history that we need to know more about.
Yeah, so Harrisburg's history, I think, is really indicative and really important of similar developments that we see in thousands of other cities during this period, which is part of the reason why in the book, Harrisburg appears in two chapters, one on school rebellions, and one on human relations commissions. In the tradition of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders that Johnson convened during the Detroit Rebellion in 1967, which is known as the Kerner Commission. But the local commissions run by the Pennsylvania State Human Relations Commissions were really key and important. And the ones in Harrisburg were some of the most robust sets of hearings that any Human Relations Commission convened. And so I really wanted to highlight that in the book. So what's interesting, again, in terms of thinking about this cycle of police violence and community violence that I mentioned, when students from William Penn and Harris High, Black students came together in February 1969 and made all these demands for, as I mentioned, more Black studies courses and more Black teachers and just kind of a more inclusive school system. I mean, literally at this time, Black and white students were getting into brawls in the hallways of these schools. And the response on the part of school authorities was not, to their demands and to their protests and to the sit-ins that they held, was not to, sit down with them and let's try to figure this out initially, but it was to send in the police. And so the result of sending in the police led this school rebellion to kind of spill into the streets of Harrisburg. And it was a protracted struggle that lasted for a few weeks until finally the school system did concede to some of the students' demands. But it reflected a kind of simmering racial tension that the Human Relations Commission in Harrisburg actually recognized shortly after Martin Luther King's assassination, saying, unless the city intervenes to address some of the underlying causes of these racial tensions, Harrisburg is going to erupt. And then a year later, it erupted. And then a few months later, after the school rebellion in the summer of June 1969, after a woman who was brutalized, named Mary Yancey, who was brutalized by police when she was attempting to buy cigarettes from a grocery store in Allison Hill, came back with a sign that read, I was brutalized by the police. There was a group of about 50 to 100 young people kind of watching the protests, and the police responded by tear gassing the entire crowd, which then set off several days of rebellion that ended in the tragic death of a Harris High student named Charles Scott, who was shot 3 times in the back and died. The officer Raymond Curtulis, who killed him, was absolved of all charges weeks later by a coroner's jury. So, again, I mean, this is a very familiar story that we see in the news all too frequently now. And of course, before, everybody had a cell phone in their pocket, and these instances were captured virally, right? But, this is just a reminder that, what we saw in 2014 with Michael Brown and George Floyd has been happening for a very long time. And in response to Charles Scott's death and the rebellion itself, the Human Relations Commission came back and held a set of hearings and made a number of recommendations to address both, tensions between police officers in the community. So it recommended a more kind of like robust police community relations program and a number of structural changes to housing code regulations so that, slumlords couldn't allow people to live in dilapidated housing, and increased integration of Harrisburg public schools, the establishment of a local human relations board, and many of these demands, very similar to the Kerner Commission case, right? And many other of these human relations commissions that came in and held hearings on the uprisings or rebellions after they occurred, never truly materialized. And so, this moment, this history represents a missed opportunity when we knew how to address many of the root causes and chose not to. And instead, again, what ends up getting embraced and supported and funded are police programs and surveillance programs and incarceration programs.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the history is fascinating. I, for one, did not realize that one of the recommendations that came out of the Human Relations Commission in Harrisburg was the creation of the city pools. Those pools are now 50 plus years old and past their useful life, and we've been, duct taping them to keep them going here. But it's something that did grow out of that, including the creation of additional parks and playgrounds in Harrisburg. But another aspect of it was that there was the establishment in Harrisburg of what they called literally a community relations division. And it was interesting to see the testimony of some of those officers before the commission basically saying that they weren't allowed to do their job. But I guess going against the concept of the thin blue line, which was that there was, sort of one universal voice for policing, you had some courageous officers basically saying, even at the time, we should have done things differently.
Yeah, so for one, thank you for highlighting that, Mayor. That is one of the successes of the 68 Human Relations Commission, is that, in response to the potential for unrest, the city did establish pools and recreation centers across Harrisburg, and to provide greater recreational access for Black youth in the city. And yeah, the story of the community relations division within the police department is tragic and really interesting too, because that was another one of the things, of the elements of recommendations from the 68 hearings that got implemented. But unfortunately, the Harrisburg Police Department didn't truly embrace the principles behind that division, which involved officers being more a direct part of the community and getting to know residents, and not the typical kind of heavy-handed response. But when that incident with Mary Yancey occurred, instead of calling first the officers from this division, the majority of whom were Black, they called in the riot squad and set off the tear gas. And so one wonders if the community division relations officers would have stepped in and the response hadn't been using tear gas to clear the crowd in a kind of violent reaction and, clubs and nightsticks, if the rebellion in '69 could have been avoided, and if Charles Scott would have then still been with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the Yancey incident happened at 13th and Market, which is still sort of ground zero for poverty in the city of Harrisburg. And you are critical of the Human Relations Commission in that you say they couldn't talk their way out of inequality. And so let's talk about the sort of systemic sort of root causes of this rebellion, because that's where we just haven't made progress. When it comes to community relations, I can tell you in Harrisburg, we've just had a long debate and discussion. We've created a new division. It's called Community Services. I think the difference this time is that we have support of the leadership within the police department, sort of top down. That's going to be helpful. But let's move even beyond the police reform to the issue of how do we address the sort of structural inequalities, and what does your book teach us?
Well, I think one of the things with respect to police that was a demand among Harrisburg residents, and that the Human Relations Commission recommended, was strong civilian oversight. I mean, this was one of the complaints of the Community Relations Division, was that when residents felt like their constitutional rights had been violated by officers, or they had been brutalized by officers, there was kind of no recourse, there was no place to go. So having kind of a strong community control and partnership over public safety mechanisms, I think, is really important. I mean, part of what I hope the book will do, and what we are beginning to do as a nation, is to think differently about how we define public safety, and how, as communities have long demanded, public safety authorities can be ceded to residents themselves. I think that's like one major thing with respect to crime control, as we call it. And then, of course, we need massive, my research shows the ways in which, in the post-civil rights period, we've allocated hundreds of millions of dollars to police and prisons and surveillance. And, this hasn't, in many communities, in some of the most vulnerable communities that still suffer from high rates of gun violence, this hasn't fostered public safety. And so now I think it's time to make a new set of investments into the kind of socioeconomic issues and the demands that residents themselves made when they rebelled. As I said at the outset of our conversation, job creation programs. We need more robust and well-resourced public schools, not just in the suburbs, but in low-income urban areas as well. And everybody should have access to healthcare and a decent place to live, that where roaches and rats and vermin aren't running around, and to really feel like they are included and a part and first-class citizens within our society. I think those are the demands of the civil rights movement more broadly, the demands that came up during the rebellions, and it's still an unfinished promise, I think, of American founding values, that today, more than ever, it is presently urgent that we begin to move towards realizing.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hinton. You're absolutely right. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of this book, America on Fire. It tells us a lot, not only about Harrisburg, but about the nation. Imagine if we had been quicker to learn the lessons of the rebellions of '68, '69, and how our history might have been different over the past generation. It's been wonderful talking to you. And again, I hope people will tune in this Tuesday, May 18th, Election Day at 6 o'clock, for a virtual conversation sponsored by Haymarket Books that will be the official book release launch for America on Fire. It's free, and you can also order a signed copy of this great book. Thank you.